chapter 6. The chapter turns its focus to the way that ideas and ideals of fatherhood entangled with race and class, and how that sort of collection of things influences sentencing in sexual assault cases. Hlavka and Mulla contrast two cases in particular here. They address some others as well, but they principally focus on two cases here to contrast them, to get sort of the scope of sentencing, but also how the court drew on notions of good and bad fathering when it addressed the defendants. They start with an exploration of the privileges historically and presently associated with fatherhood in terms of moral authority, rights over members of the family, and related expectations of providing for the family. They note, however, that the court's invocations of these privileges and of the obligations varied significantly with the race of the defendant. In the first case, then, they turned to Tony Young, a black defendant who maintained his innocence throughout, and who in the end was excoriated by the judge, while by contrast Isaac Miller, a white defendant, though also sentenced, was lauded from the bench for his contrition and his sincerity. Their specific embodiments of fatherhood, that is Young and Miller, figured centrally in the court's responses to them. So, the authors write, examining these various moments in which fatherhood was invoked in its idealized and caricatured forms shed light on the ways in which the court reproduced white heteropatriarchal notions of appropriate performances of masculinity according to racialized and classed notions of the welfare state. In this first case, State versus Tony Young, Tasha, now age 16, testified to abuse by her father, Tony Young, when she would stay at his home. So her parents were not together, and so she would spend prescribed time at her father's place. And testified that this abuse occurred from the time that she was 7 until she was 9. Now, there's something interesting here. It's not directly the focus of the chapter, but the authors pay attention to how Tasha's account showed that she had internalized the unlikelihood that she would be believed. So this is a theme that has cropped up with witness testimony in previous chapters as well, but in a particular way here. So when asked why she did not tell anyone about the abuse, she said that she was raised to be obedient, not to tell adults what she thought they ought to do, and that she thought nobody would believe a father would molest a child. And so we can see here the precariousness of the victim witness is amplified even further when the witness is a child, to the point even that she sort of preemptively negates her own experience and avoids telling any of the adults in her life what's going on. Hlavka and Mulla, want to draw attention to how the judge frames Young's transgression in terms of bad fathering. Whoops. In short, they say, Judge Williams formulated his address as a failure to correctly father. He argued that Tony Young's actions had not only damaged Tasha, but also irreparably damaged the father-daughter relationship. Now, Isaac Young, they provide as the contrast to the both the sentencing and the way that the judge addresses Tony Young. In Miller's case, he chose to plead guilty to second-degree sexual assault of his 12-year-old daughter instead of going to trial. So that's the first contrast, not pleading his innocence, but rather pleading guilty. Now, Miller does argue for mitigation, though. So he explains that in a sleepy stupor, he assumed that it was his wife in the bed beside him rather than his stepdaughter, so that when he touched her, he was touching her within this sort of haze of sleepiness and misidentifying who it was. The prosecutor, by contrast, was unpersuaded and cited his ability to recall the details of the assault with clarity that sort of threw into question his claims of stupefaction. After a statement in which, quote, Miller seemed the very embodiment of contrition, the judge noted for the record his obvious sincerity. So Judge Darr's sentence of 2 years in custody with 2 under supervision amounting to 4 years stayed contrasts sharply with Young's sentence of 25 years in custody and 15 under extended supervision. Hlavka and Mulla focus our attention in this section less on the sentences than on the judge's contrasting forms of address in the two cases, and in several other cases, which they explore in less detail, and that they use to describe how the forms of admonishment judges directed at defendants and their families served as forms of disciplining. They note a number of consistencies. They say, these events and their documentation in court repositories reproduced official narratives of the failures of the father, characterized by penal logics at the intersections of race and class. As a racializing practice, Black and Latino or Latina fathers were faulted for their perpetration of parental harm, and that paternal harm was interpreted as socially learned and socially transmissible. Right, so not just isolated to the individual defendant, but having a sort of larger social contagion, if you will. In the concluding section, the authors recalled an interview with a prosecutor who explained that, in her experience, Black or poor white or Hispanic defendants did not get worse sentences because of their race or economic status, but that rather wealthier defendants got better deals or better sentences, in large part because their resources allowed them to seek private rehabilitation for court-ordered drug treatment and sex offender therapy. Compounding the lack of such resources, a defendant like Young, Black man, right, both faces stiffer sentences and is cast as an unsuccessful father during the sentencing. So this is in contrast to Miller, who faced comparatively less opprobrium, the judge noting Miller's evident sincerity, and who, because he had the resources, did take advantage of the opportunities for rehabilitation, for private treatment, that the prosecutor noted above. And as we saw, had a significantly different sentence than Young did. So Hlavka and Mulla capture the dynamic like this. In the courts, the cultural signifier of fatherhood is narrated through tropes of masculinity, sexual power, virility, and aggression. It is the judge's decision whether to frame these tropes as appropriate and normative versus abnormal and criminal. By extension, the court would often take up the rhetoric of fatherhood to justify a particular sentence. Quote, when the defendant was a father, his violence was framed through his ability to exhibit or withhold parental care. In weighing a sentence, the court reconfigured the father figure within common heteropatriarchal understandings of family and of manhood along a spectrum of successful and failed fatherhood. One iteration of this was the frequent marking of Black sex offenders as themselves poorly fathered, hence the idea of the broader community and this kind of transmissibility, and in turn poorly fathering their own children, And this was a trope that was just not common for white defendants. So there is a racial connection here. In this way, white fatherhood was in general unmarked and therefore did not register as a social phenomenon in the way that black fatherhood registers as a social phenomenon of a particular kind. They say, it was unraced and void of cultural stereotypes, leading to the admonishment of white fathers as individual bad actors rather than as products and perpetuators, of a dysfunctional community. All right, and so that brings us to the final chapter. We'll turn to that in the next lecture. Thank you very much.